Ceterum autem censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Thus spoke Marcus Cato at the end of every speech before the Senate as he neared the end of his life. Translated simply into English, this means, furthermore, I think that Carthage must be destroyed. It is the late summer of the year 151 BC. Massinissa, ally of Rome, is still king over Numidia in Africa. His forces have been encroaching on Carthaginian cities there for decades, and at this moment they are besieging the city of Oroscopa. The Carthaginians have begged Rome for decades to save them from this aggression. The terms of the treaty that they made after the Second Punic War, 50 years before, do not allow Carthage to defend itself without Roman permission. But now Carthaginian patience has worn out. They muster an army and send it to meet the Numidians in battle. There are some 25,000 Carthaginians in this army, led by a general named Hasdrubal. This army is mostly composed of native Carthaginians. Long gone are the days when they could hire mercenaries to do the fighting for them. Along with them have come some 6,000 Numidian turncoats who were willing to fight against Massinissa's domination over their people. The battle between these two forces, Carthaginian and Numidian, lasts all day. As evening nears, both forces retire to their camps, but the Carthaginians have been clearly bested. Now watching the battle all day was a young Roman officer by the name of Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. He was the son of that Aemilius Paulus who had won the Third Macedonian War, but as a small child he had been adopted by the adult son of Scipio Africanus, to whom he was also distantly related. So he represented the lineage, the bloodline, and the traditions of two great Roman houses. After the battle, Hasdrubal sent negotiators to see this Scipio Aemilianus, whom we shall usually just call Scipio for the remainder of this podcast. These envoys asked him to arbitrate between the two forces and bring them to terms. Ultimately, this attempt at peace between the two forces, Numidian and Carthaginian, would fail. But Carthage's capacity to quickly raise and field an army had startled the Roman Senate. Already Marcus Cato had been repeating again and again that Carthage must be destroyed. Possibly when that aging senator had visited Africa a few years before on a diplomatic mission, he had been shocked by the signs of renewed vitality in the city of this ancient enemy. For 5 decades now, Carthage had not been able to send out colonies as she once did, so naturally her local population had grown. And the people of the city had become prosperous again, slowly learning how to make agriculture and their ties to Libya profitable, now that their overseas trading empire was gone. The Numidians, after these peace talks failed, would defeat Hasdrubal's army, and this failed general would later be forced out of the city, whose people had to accept another humiliating military loss which they could not redress without fear of Roman invasion. This rankled the Carthaginians, who had grown tired of submitting to Numidian aggression, and they were becoming increasingly vocal about their need to defend themselves. Now, having borne witness to Carthage's unexpected ability to quickly man what amounted to the equivalent of a consular army, Scipio would return to Rome. But the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus would be back. As there were 3 Punic Wars, it might be easy to think that there was peace between the wars, that the Mediterranean during the half-century between the Second Punic War and the Third had experienced a season of tranquility. But nothing could be further from the truth. As I said before, each year Rome elected 2 consuls, and each year those consuls had something military to do, and more often than not, that something military was full-blown warfare. In fact, in the years right before the war, Rome had actually been struggling to fill the ranks of its legions to fight so many simultaneous conflicts. Putting down rebellions in Spain was costing Roman blood, even as it profited Rome in terms of treasure. And just as the Third Punic War finally was declared in 149 BC, other Roman legions were completing the conquest and enslavement of Greece. In a foreshadow of Carthage's fate, that year the city of Corinth was razed to the ground. Now, this first half of the 2nd century before Christ was also the end for many great figures described in previous episodes, and before continuing, let's take a moment to see them off. Hannibal, after coordinating the peace after the Second Punic War, was instrumental in helping the city of Carthage to regain its political and financial bearings. But by sometime around 195 BC, the Roman Senate became convinced that he was communicating with the Greeks of the Seleucid Empire, which ruled over Mesopotamia and Anatolia, and that he was now an open enemy of Rome. Before the Romans could demand his surrender, Hannibal fled. What followed for him were years of gainful employment with Rome's enemies. Hannibal first aided Antiochus, the king over the Seleucid Empire, for many years. However, after a battlefield loss in 189 BC, which resulted in Rome taking control over most of Anatolia, that is modern-day Turkey, Hannibal once again had to flee in order to avoid being handed over to the Romans. He then found work leading fleets and armies for other enemies of Rome in the eastern Mediterranean, until, after another defeat, Flamininus, a Roman general and statesman about whom we spoke in a previous episode, threatened to capture Carthage's greatest general. This would have been sometime between 183 and 181 BC. The date is uncertain. Hannibal took poison rather than suffer Roman captivity, and so passed out of our story. His nemesis, Scipio Africanus, died around the same time as Hannibal, actually after a long and successful political and military career. His final days before dying of natural causes were passed in peaceful retirement on his estate in Italy. In the meantime, Aemilius Paulus, hero of the Third Macedonian War, had also died. During his life, he had divorced his first wife when they were still young and had 2 young children. Since Aemilius Paulus went on to have heirs with another woman, these first sons of his were eventually adopted by other aristocratic families. The youngest of the 2 was adopted by the adult son of Scipio Africanus, and this child took the name of Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. He was that young officer who observed the battle near Carthage that summer of 151 BC, and he would live up to the glory of all his names. Of all the Scipios in our story, he is the one singularly known as Scipio. Flamininus had also passed by now, as the third and final Punic War approached. Only 2 figures from the era of the Second Punic War survived. Massinissa, the Numidian High King, now in his 80s, was still holding on to power, still warring against a vulnerable but stubbornly viable Carthage. And Marcus Cato, that arch-conservative pillar of Roman tradition, also endured. He spent his remaining energy reminding everyone that Carthage must be destroyed. He had participated in a commission sent to Africa sometime before that battle overseen by Scipio Aemilianus, and he had been urging war ever since. Initially, when Scipio reported back on what he had seen at that battle in Africa, the Senate was divided as to how to proceed. The war party had a strong voice in Marcus Cato, of course. Others perhaps, though, thought that the destruction of Carthage was neither necessary nor warranted. Surely a heavy fine, such as a penalty for overstepping the bounds of the treaty, would be sufficient. A year passed. The Carthaginians grew nervous because it became known that Rome had raised an army without disclosing its purpose. They sent envoys to the Roman Senate and asked plainly, "What must we do to make reparations to Rome?" The senators replied that the Carthaginians must give satisfaction to the Roman people. The ambassadors were mystified. They asked for clarification. What did this mean? The only reply given was, "You know perfectly well what this means." The Senate's purpose remained opaque, and the Carthaginian envoys went home without any clear ideas as to what the future held. The future held war. The new consuls for the year 149 BC did not have to wait for March or May in order to assume office as they had in the past. Prior to 153 BC, new consuls had always taken office later in the year, though they were typically elected in the autumn of the previous year. Now, newly elected consuls took power quickly on January 1st of the new year and got to work right away. As 149 BC opened, Rome had already begun seducing other African cities and towns away from Carthage. Utica, a city in Africa north of Carthage, had resisted a Roman siege at the end of the Second Punic War. This city had long been jealous of the capital at Carthage, and now they gladly broke away and entered into an alliance with Rome. Thus, as Roman armies shipped across the Mediterranean, they found a friendly port and a supply base just 30 miles from Carthage itself. The Carthaginians now knew that they stood little chance against Roman supremacy. They had already discussed the possibility of deditio. Deditio, you might remember from the episodes on the earliest days of the Republic, was a formal and unconditional surrender to Rome. When a city offered itself up as deditio, it meant that Rome could and would do as it pleased with the city and its inhabitants. Throughout Rome's history, though, this political license had usually come with some restraint. Rome might punish or even execute some people in the city that it considered dangerous, but generally everyone else escaped with their lives. In many cases, in fact, Rome had actually been quite benevolent and had done very little to the city that delivered itself up in deditio. They simply occupied it and brought it bloodlessly into its league of allies and subjects. On a couple of occasions in recent memory, though, in Greek Epirus, for instance, thousands had been slaughtered, even after they had thrown themselves upon Rome's mercy. But now there was no other hope. When new Carthaginian envoys arrived in Rome, they found that war had already been declared, and Roman legionaries had boarded ships to invade Carthage. So the Carthaginian plenipotentiaries offered up the city in deditio. Rome accepted the offer. The Senate promised freedom and life for all Carthaginians, but there were conditions. First, Carthage would have to send 300 hostages from noble families to Rome. Now, I've spoken before about this practice of taking hostages. It does not mean that these individuals were tied up, beaten, starved, blindfolded, or anything like that. They would live a privileged but guarded life in Rome. If Carthage ever betrayed the terms of the deditio, these hostages could be killed or sold into slavery. Second, Carthage had to turn over all its weaponry and war equipment to the consuls, who were already over in Africa, restoring and occupying Castra Cornelia. That was the fortress built on the African coast during the Second Punic War, not far from Utica, where much of the Roman fleet was now docked. The Carthaginians met this demand as well. They handed over 200,000 sets of heavy infantry equipment, all the armor and weapons used by their land forces, as well as their siege weapons, such as catapults. Furthermore, they were told that they simply must obey anything that the consuls told them to do. So after Carthage had turned over the hostages to Rome and rendered the city completely defenseless by surrendering their weaponry, the consuls made a new demand. The Roman historian Appian quotes the consuls thus: "Evacuate Carthage and hand it over to us, and move your place of habitation to any part of your territory that you wish, at least 10 miles from the sea. We have decided to destroy the city." An orgy of despair, that's what historian Brian Caven calls the reaction of the Carthaginian populace when they heard this final demand. In the public tumult, the leaders who had negotiated the peace, along with their families, were openly attacked, as were any Italian merchants that still resided in the city. Nevertheless, city leaders asked for a truce in order to send another embassy to Rome to renegotiate the terms. Even as they made the request, a fleet of 20 Roman quinqueremes appeared menacingly on the ocean horizon. The consuls refused. Carthage must obey. And so now, only after delivering up all her armaments, Carthage decided to fight. The gates of the city were closed and manned. City leaders sent a mission to General Hasdrubal, whom they had exiled, and they declared that they wished him to be their new army leader, and they begged for his return. Almost overnight, the entire city was turned into a workshop for war. Temples became places to fashion weapons and armor. Even young children were put to work. All slaves were freed and given citizenship so that they might fight to defend their city. In open public spaces, women shaved their heads so that their hair might be twined into ropes, in particular to help construct new catapults to defend the city. And Carthage was still protected by her ancient defenses. The city sat, as all Phoenician cities had always sat, at the end of a small peninsula. Long ago, across the isthmus of this peninsula, they had dug a wide ditch, and beyond this 3 successive walls, each higher than the one before. The last of these 3 walls was 45 feet high and 30 feet wide. There were tall, sturdy towers in the wall at 200-foot intervals. Just inside this wall, there were spaces and storehouses and barracks for war elephants, for horses, and for over 20,000 soldiers. Even on her knees, the city of Carthage would not be easy to take. The Roman consuls apparently sensed this. They did not immediately attack, but instead focused on taking control of nearby towns, securing their own supply lines and defenses. It was known that Hasdrubal was somewhere in the Libyan desert with an army, coming to the rescue of the city that had exiled him. When the Romans finally turned their attention to the city of Carthage itself that year, they focused on one particular point, a critical weakness in all the magnificent defenses of the city. To the south of the city proper, and undefended by any walls, was a tongue of land that extended across the open waterway and separated from the sea what was then called the Lake of Tunis. The Phoenicians, who had constructed the city centuries ago, probably never imagined the city being without a navy, so there was no need to worry about this stretch of solid earth which reached up to the city, which was here defended by a much less impressive wall than that which had been erected on the isthmus. The Romans seized this thin promontory of land and made extreme efforts to exploit this weakness in Carthage's defenses. They even breached the walls with their rams, but were beaten back. The Carthaginians inside the walls became ever more inventive and daring as well. They constructed fireboats and pushed them out to sea, where they might collide with and set fire to Roman sea vessels. And as the years passed, the Romans also had to fight off harassing attacks made by Hasdrubal, who roamed the countryside with a small army. Scipio Aemilianus was one of the officers fighting here in many of these actions. He was probably chagrined by his superior's lack of imagination and daring. His bravery and his forethought were notable always, and word of his military acumen got back to Rome. In fact, he was sent later that year on a mission to meet with Massinissa, the Numidian king, in order to bring him into the war. But Scipio arrived only to find Massinissa having just died from old age. Now this Scipio Aemilianus was the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, whom Massinissa fondly remembered from their days warring together in the Second Punic War. Nevertheless, the young Roman commander may have been surprised to discover that the old king had left him as executor of his kingdom. Wisely, Scipio divided the Numidian kingdom equitably between Massinissa's grandsons. Thus, they all, each of them, owed something to Rome, but none of them would be powerful enough to ever be a threat to Roman supremacy. In the meantime, Marcus Cato also succumbed to old age at his new estate in Italy. With him died all the memories of an older age in Rome. New men had come onto the stage to fight a new war and to begin a new age in Rome. New consuls were elected in Rome to take over the war in 148 BC. The public was frustrated by the delay in finishing off Carthage. A process which had promised to be short and nearly bloodless was now costing them heavily in terms of blood and treasure. Carthage still stood, and the city, though cut off from its traditional sources of provision in Africa, was still master of Libya, from whence it continued to receive tribute and supplies by sea. The Romans had not been able to effectively blockade the port. The new consuls were as spectacularly unsuccessful as the previous consuls. The year wasted away in ineffective attacks and assaults on smaller targets outside Carthage, which only distracted from the purpose of the expedition, to destroy Carthage once and for all. As the end of 148 BC approached, the people of Rome had had enough. Not only had the war with Carthage dragged on for too long, but a Roman army had also been defeated that year in Greece. Suddenly things were looking grim again for a people that had seemed invincible for decades. The popular assembly in Rome, seeking a commander who could end this war now, proposed Scipio Aemilianus as a candidate to the office of consul for the coming year. There was only one problem. Scipio was not technically qualified, being too young and not having passed through the strict cursus honorum, that series of lesser offices which a man was expected to hold before going on to become consul. Scipio had never even been praetor. On these grounds, one of the standing consuls of 148 BC, a man with the imposing name of Spurius Postumius Albinus Magnus, refused to consider Scipio's candidacy. But Scipio not only had the support of the people, but also that of two grand families whose blood and names he had received, the houses of Aemilius Paulus and of Scipio Africanus. The laws which prohibited a man like Scipio from becoming consul, therefore, were not annulled but only suspended for a year in order to allow him to lead the fight in Africa. Thus, on January 1st, 147 BC, Scipio ascended to power and brought all of Rome's might against Carthage. Quickly, he laid full siege to the city itself. With a small force, he breached the walls, and there was such panic in the city after he did that Hasdrubal was forced to abandon his field camp and bring his army into the city to defend the gap in the walls. The Romans were beaten back, but Scipio had never really intended to conquer the city with the small force that he had used to break in that day. His real goal had been accomplished, though. Scipio had brought Hasdrubal into the city, and now he would never leave to lead armies against the Romans in the field again. Scipio now dug his own trenches across the isthmus and just beyond the walls of Carthage. Hasdrubal unleashed his rage on Roman prisoners that had been taken during the course of the war so far. He tortured and executed them atop the city walls, where Roman legionaries could see every one of their torments. Hasdrubal essentially became a military dictator inside the walls of the city, which had now, in its death throes, disconnected itself from all its traditions, political, financial, moral. Carthage had just become one trapped, roiling mass of humanity, struggling to survive. Now, inside the walls of the city, there were lands to farm, but the provision they supplied was not enough to feed the whole city populace, in addition to all the refugees who had come in from the countryside during the war. But the expansive harbor of Carthage was screened from outside view. Here, the desperate populace, men, women, and children, labored day and night at shipbuilding. They somehow managed to construct 50 triremes. This was not a fleet that could take on the Roman navy, but it could inflict a devastating blow. Their harbor outlet sealed by the Romans, the Carthaginians dug out a new exit through the wall that faced the open sea, and these 50 triremes, as well as a host of smaller craft, suddenly emerged one day to the Romans' great surprise. The Carthaginians had not been sailors for decades, though. 3 days later, the Romans gathered their fleet and drove these ships back into the harbor, never to emerge again. Scipio spent the remainder of the year sending out detachments to the countryside to reduce all remaining points loyal to Carthage. Late in the year, he defeated the last remaining Carthaginian army forces in the field and took Libya out of the war. As the year closed, though, Scipio would not be returned as consul, nor was he officially named as proconsul, but it did not matter. As the year 146 BC opened, he was in command in Africa, no matter who Rome sent over as consul. This was another sign of the old, strict adherence to Roman political customs breaking down. Even the great Marcellus had come in from the field when his time in command was up, and returned to some other duty in the capital. That spring, Scipio launched the final assault on Carthage. One of the first to go over the walls was a young man by the name of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. He was a cousin of Scipio's and descended from a line of equally great Roman names. We will hear more about Tiberius Gracchus in a future episode. The Roman soldiers became distracted once they saw the ancient temple of the god Resheph, a sort of Phoenician version of Apollo. This same god had been worshipped thousands of years before in Syria, and he may have been a version of the same god worshipped by the priest Chryses in the Iliad. The Roman soldiers tore the place apart, looting it for its many treasures. House-to-house fighting ensued. Then Scipio gave the final, terrible order: set the city on fire. Carthage burned for 6 days and nights. The conflagration consumed the inhabitants much as the fires of Moloch had consumed infant sacrifices in years past. Men, women, and children were incinerated indiscriminately. It is said that Scipio watched the destruction from atop a nearby hill, where he wept at what was lost, as a great city and a once great people were erased from history. As each city block fell into smoldering ruin, Roman soldiers cleared the ground, leaving the citadel more and more exposed. Here, inside the city's central fortress, Hasdrubal and the city's surviving populace and defenders had taken refuge. Suppliants came to Scipio now. They begged for the mere lives of those starving inside this redoubt. Scipio was merciful and agreed. 50,000 men, women, and children exited the citadel and were marched off to be sold into slavery. Inside, only Hasdrubal and his family remained, along with 900 Roman deserters, men who had, during the course of war, for one reason or another, gone over to the Carthaginian side and now fought for Rome's enemy. These were naturally excluded from any amnesty. These bitter enders held out even as Scipio assaulted them once again. They knew that they would never be granted any forgiveness, and they knew that they must fight to the death. Finally, though, when the end was clearly inevitable, the survivors of this hopeless crew withdrew into the temple within the citadel, and they set it on fire, giving their lives to the flames. But even as they were setting fire to the sanctuary, Hasdrubal emerged. The Carthaginian general, who had become the city's last lord, had opted to avoid death in the flames and now threw himself down before Scipio and begged for his life. There was one more bit of drama, though, as this tragic play reached the final scene of its final act. In the doorway of the temple, now going up in flames, appeared the wife and young children of Hasdrubal. This haughty woman, garbed in her finest apparel, stood and hurled abuse at her husband, reviling his cowardice, his failure as a man. Then she turned, taking the children with her, and plunged into the flames. The Third Punic War was over. There is a popular myth which states that the Romans not only leveled the city of Carthage itself, but also salted the land upon which it stood, so that no one would ever be able to grow crops there and support a population. The facts, however, are in essential agreement with this idea. It was legally prohibited to build upon the ruins or to restore them. Nevertheless, Carthage would rise from the dead. A few centuries later, in fact, under the empire, Carthage would once again be the capital of Roman Africa and a prosperous city. Not until the Muslims conquered the city in AD 698 would Carthage finally pass forever from the pages of ancient history. Today, Carthage is a Tunisian suburb and home to the ruins of the ancient city, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Time and the rubble of war's passage has absorbed the blood and the screams of the doomed. Why Carthage lost this final war is clear. Rome was larger and far more powerful by several orders of magnitude. This was not David and Goliath. This was Goliath and a field mouse. Why, though, did Carthage lose the 118-year conflict that began with the First Punic War in 264 BC? How had this mighty Phoenician empire fared so poorly against a moderately sized Italian upstart republic that had more enemies than friends? Against a people of comparatively low culture? Against men who had no navy when the First War broke out? Against a people whose aristocrats had never even ventured off their boot-shaped peninsula? People write entire books searching for these reasons, but they can be summed up rather simply. The Carthaginians, at least up until the end, saw the entire thing through the eyes of merchants. They hazarded the first war with Rome as a financial venture, like other men might invest in a business scheme. It might turn out to be profitable. It might not. If it didn't, they would just cut their losses and turn their attention elsewhere. It probably never even crossed Carthaginian minds that the Romans would swear blood vengeance, such that even a century later, Roman senators like Marcus Cato would be calling for their city's destruction even after it had been essentially emasculated. Perhaps historian Brian Caven sums it up best with the following quote: "The Carthaginian nobles could not enter into the mind of an aristocracy which identified the interest of the community with the pursuit of glory." As you might remember, Roman senators died in droves on the battlefields of these wars. They preferred a valiant death in combat over sensible negotiation with a powerful enemy. Carthaginians simply could not understand this. Perhaps few of us today can. Once the Roman fleet was destroyed during the First Punic War, most people in the same position as the Romans would have tried to negotiate an honorable peace. But the Romans never even considered that possibility. As Brian Caven also says, the Romans did not have the habit of counting costs. It wasn't about taking control of Sicily or taking control of Spain. It was really about expressing their manhood. They were going to show these Carthaginians that they were better men, and they did. But ultimately, Rome's greatly increased power and wealth would absorb all that virile Roman honor, much as time and scattered stone debris absorbed the horror of Carthage's final immolation. The coming episodes will describe, in slow detail, Rome's own descent into decadence and then into madness. Nevertheless, it would be both a historical and a moral error to equate all things and all people. I have said before that however much I might sympathize with Carthage at one point or another, I am glad that it was Rome that came out victorious in this conflict, and not the other way around. Even if they could be brutal and pig-headed sometimes, there was something, many things really, noble about the Roman people. I quoted some remarks of historian Will Durant at the beginning of this series when he spoke about the Romans. These fascinating folk, their taut muscles, swift love and anger, smoldering or blazing eyes, the pride and fury that made Italy great and tore her to pieces. Nearly all the men are virile and handsome, nearly all the women beautiful, strong, and brave. Historian Brian Caven, who is not averse to criticizing the Romans at all, nevertheless provides a nice contrast to this praise for the Roman people when he makes his own final remarks on the people of Carthage. The Carthaginians were hardly an attractive people. They did not have it in them to be the standard bearers of higher civilization. Selfish, parasitic, money-grubbing, they could never have provided the means by which all that was best in Hellenic culture could be disseminated over so much of Europe. This is backhanded praise of Rome, but note an important detail in what he says there. Ultimately, Rome is to be praised because it became a vehicle to sustain and pass on Greek culture, the same Greek culture that traditional Romans like Marcus Cato despised, the same culture against which the Romans had been fighting at the same time in Greece. The Roman army defeat by Greek rebels in 148 BC had been reversed by the end of the Third Punic War, and mainland Greece entered almost simultaneously with Carthage into its complete submission to Rome. It's probably not just Rome's transmission of Hellenic culture which led to so many people, right up until the present day, cherishing Rome's contribution to the West. Without any doubt, for much of history, the West has looked back on Rome with admiration, not primarily due to its political or military traditions, which were often brutal and always varied in implementation anyway, but rather because it became the vehicle by which Christianity, as well as Greek knowledge, was passed down to us. Again, though, it seems strange that neither Christianity nor Greek heritage have anything to do with those Roman pioneers of the 8th century BC, those rough men who cobbled together a tiny republic from the dregs of central Italian society. They probably could not have imagined that they would found a city-state that would transmit such alien ideas as a patrimony. There is something else, though, which we can say about the distinction between Carthage and Rome, which might also sound pleasing to modern ears. Carthage preferred to keep her allies and subjects primitive. These undeveloped peoples provided her with raw goods that they could then sell or process, and Carthage was happy to keep things this way without any real competition. Rome's history is different. Whatever we may think about her methods of expansion, her criminal justice system, and so on, Rome, over the long haul, shared knowledge and her civilization with her new citizens and with her new friends. Certainly, Rome oppressed peoples. It suppressed their autonomy, exploited their resources, but over time, in virtually every situation, Rome's conquest turned into more Rome, into clean city streets, sturdy roads, better and more food, a reliable system of law, a comparatively educated populace, and so on. But this is not a neat history. Yes, there are many instances in which we can admire Romans and what they do for their fellow men. But there are also many terrible moments, like the destruction of Carthage, that make us draw back from completely embracing our sometimes cruel cultural ancestors. With the Third Punic War behind us now, we are entering into a new period of Roman history that will have many dark moments. I speak of the period of the late Republic, when the political traditions of ancient Rome began to unravel, and a series of strong men take the reins of government in a republic whose power has grown beyond the limitations of primitive democracy. A revolution is coming, and the spark that lights the fire will be set off by that young man who climbed the walls of Carthage, by Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, who will come home from war to a republic whose people have begun to feel like outcasts in their own land. But all that is for the next episode. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.